something that people often forget is that there's a lot more to art and culture than what the eye can see, right? There's all these objects, there's plenty of them here at TEFAF, places, sites, they all hold stories of makers and the communities that they take care of them. And while we're often very busy with protecting all these things in museums, heritage sites, we sometimes forget to also take care of the stories that are behind them and about what makes them important for the communities that live around them. And something that we do at Cultural Emergency Response is actually exactly that. We work together with people to protect their cultural heritage, but also the stories that make them be alive and that give them value. My name is Sanne Letschert. I'm Director of Cultural Emergency Response. And we support local experts and actors in crisis situations to protect their cultural heritage when it's under threat. So we work, as Simone just said, a little bit as a cultural ambulance, where we do care about the things. So we stabilize heritage buildings, we evacuate museum collections, but we also make sure that communities can stay in touch with their cultural practices and that we support a sense of cultural continuity for them. And TEFAF has been a supporter of our work for a very long time already. So I'm very grateful for the platform here today and that we can also speak why this work is actually so important. And in the conversation today, I'm actually very excited to bring two different perspectives together. So we do usually work very much on heritage protection in a tangible form, but what does it mean when we're protecting these stories exactly? And I'm very much looking forward to zooming in on a specific art form, an art practice, which is weaving and textile arts. And this is an art practice in which many different things come together. We talk about identity, cultural memory, resilience, healing, and I'm very much looking forward to explore this from two different perspectives, a heritage perspective and a contemporary arts perspective, with two special guests that I'm now going to introduce to you. I have Nathalie Paarlberg, CEO of Turquoise Mountain, and artist Enam Gbewonyo. She's represented by TEFAF exhibitor Tafeta. So welcome. Well, let's start at the beginning. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit how heritage art, textile art is part of your daily life? Enam, shall we start with you?
Hi, so yeah, I'm a textile and performance artist. Born in England, my family are from Ghana. I'm from the Epe tribe, and so I always say that kind of textiles and performance are kind of inherent to who I am. And you know, my journey, I started in fashion design and worked in education before starting my arts career. So it feels kind of it was meant to be that I became a textile and performance artist. I've been working now for over 14 years, and I think over kind of the last 6 or 7 years, I really saw a gear shift in my practice, and that was also partly because textile arts became more accepted within the fine art canon. I know we'll talk about that later down the line. And so it's been a really interesting journey, and I think along the line it's also been about me exploring more about my heritage as a Ghanaian, as an Epe woman, and how that then feeds into the work. And it's kind of led me to start thinking more about African spirituality and how textiles has always been part of that way of kind of visual language and archiving, and how we then kind of create those customs within the textile work.
Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more about that soon. Nathalie?
Hi, my name is Nathalie. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Turquoise Mountain. That's an organization dedicated to cultural heritage and to supporting artisans where they or their traditions are under threat. And we do that mainly in the Middle East and in Asia. And before I took on this specific role with Turquoise Mountain, I was with the organization for 3 years in Afghanistan and then for 3 years in Myanmar. And both countries just have the most incredible and diverse textile traditions, from Turkmen weaving in the north of Afghanistan to Pashtun embroidery traditions in the south. And then in Myanmar too, there are literally hundreds of ethnic groups, and all of them have their very distinct textile traditions. So I had the privilege of working with weavers in both of those places for many years, and that's kind of, my connection with textiles and heritage.
Great. Perfect combination, I'd say, of different views of looking at this art practice, but also as a symbol of cultural identity, I think. And before we get into a little bit more details about the type of work that you do, maybe we can try to understand a little bit better why textiles have this quality to combine all these different stories that are behind the objects and the practice, actually. Maybe, Enam, you can share something about that.
Sure. I think kind of thinking about my own heritage and how it's always been a way of kind of cementing our history. We were never people that kind of wrote down our histories. It was always oral or visual. And so textiles became part of that. So I know especially for us with the Ewe tribe, there are specific symbols that we weave into our textiles, our cloth, and they're significant, whether it's for wedding or for kind of the family name. It's those ways of kind of cementing our histories into kind of a lived experience.
Okay, thank you. And having that background, I think it's now interesting to make it a little bit more concrete, so you also understand what that actually means when we speak about protecting this type of heritage. You both are working on protecting it in different ways. Nathalie, can you give an example of how you've been doing that in your recent work?
We take a very holistic approach to working with artisans. So we try and support them with what they need to thrive. And at the heart of that is, of course, the craft itself, but there's a lot around that. And we try and be very nimble. An example from Myanmar, where we work with weaver communities around a place called Inle Lake, where they have these wonderful traditions where they use the root of the lotus flower in the lake to create this yarn, and then they weave using this yarn. They also have a very specific dyeing tradition, an ikat tradition that kind of came through Thailand and then really kind of settled around the lake. In September last year, there was a huge storm in Myanmar, and actually the wider Southeast Asian region. And many hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, but it was particularly bad around Inle Lake. People there live in bamboo homes, and the communities with whom we worked experienced severe flooding. So that meant raw materials were gone, looms destroyed, and so on. And actually, with help from cultural emergency response, because you are an ambulance that comes to the rescue in these types of situations, we were able to provide weavers with raw materials, with looms, so that they could resume their practice, because the practice is inherently tied to their livelihood. This is how these people generate income for themselves, for their families, and for the wider community. So that's just one example of the type of work that we undertake.
Yeah. And that was, of course, also in a context of an ongoing conflict in Myanmar for many years already. Then a flood comes over that, and that's quite devastating, I can imagine, for the communities working with this as part of their daily lives. Can you tell us a little bit how you see that then weaving is something that offers them stability or a sense of continuity in a context like this?
Yeah. At a very fundamental level, it is, like I said, it's their livelihood. So if they cannot weave, they can't earn an income, and so it's crucial. And part of the work that Turquoise Mountain does is very much connecting these weavers to international markets to kind of facilitate the sale of their craft products. But it's also something more than that, because as you mentioned in your introduction, Sanne, textiles, weaving, it really, and what we call intangible cultural heritage is part of a community's identity. It's their lifeblood. It's who they are. They tell the stories about the community, their history, through this type of work. So being able to create again, to be productive in the literal sense of producing something and of bringing beauty into the world, it's not a luxury. It's not something that is still true in times of crisis. It's especially true in times of crisis, to root people again to a sense of self when everything around you is in upheaval, when so much is being destroyed. The ability to create and to bring beauty into the world is very important, on top of just earning a livelihood.
Yeah, thank you. Enam, maybe now for you, can you give a concrete example of your work and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk about one of the pieces that I made as a result of a residency I did in Dakar, Senegal. And so that was actually part of both a performance film and artistic works. And because I also talk about sustainability within my practice, I really wanted to hone in on the issue of waste colonization, in that so much of our secondhand clothing goods gets sent to many countries across Africa. And there's such a mass of it that even though they do sell them within the market, so much of it ends up in landfill. And so it's become a huge environmental issue. And so some of my work is trying to highlight that. And so it's something that also directly impacts Senegalese women. So because my work is very much talking about the Black women's experience, it was tying those two things in, but then also creating space for healing, which is something that I also talk about within textile practice, both in the making and the actual work itself, how it can provide spaces of healing. And so that was just a really beautiful way of having that experience in Dakar, going to the secondhand markets, buying fabric from those markets, and then creating work that becomes a platform to talk about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying, because actually the also in connection to healing, the practice itself is an important part of your work too.
Yes.
Could you share a little bit more how you see that and how that contributes to the meaning of your work?
Yeah, so I think just in the actual making of the work, it's for me, it's a very spiritual practice. And I do believe for most indigenous tribes that make textiles, that is part of the practice. It's that embodiment piece, like you were kind of saying, of how just physically making makes you feel alive, but it's also very meditative. And I think we've talked before about even the fact that during COVID, so many people started to pick up knitting needles, just something, as a way to kind of release the tension and the stress from the body. But I also talk about it in terms of the actual clothing that we wear. Everything is energy. It's, we're all kind of made up of atoms, as are our clothing. And so as you go about your day, the energy, however you're feeling, those emotions are kind of fed through the clothing. And so in a way, they can speak for you. And again, that relates to my work, because I'm always talking about how for so many Black women, they don't have a voice. And so by using used clothing as well within the work, it becomes the voice for them and can tell their stories.
Yeah, and especially in women communities, I think textile and the practice of weaving has been, well, a certain way of expressing identity. And Nathalie, you also touched upon, actually, it's a lifeline, it's a sense of stability. Do you also recognize that healing quality of weaving, and maybe even a bit bigger, that projects that you do then with these communities, does that help them in a way to process the trauma they are currently living?
Yeah, and I think, that's very much true, I think, both for Afghanistan and in Myanmar, and also something what you were saying, how textiles and women and how that is so interlinked. And there's the meditative aspect of weaving, there's the ability to create, but also at a slightly more at the societal level, when I think about Afghanistan, for example, an estimated 1 million women are working as weavers in Afghanistan. It's actually carpets is a huge industry in Afghanistan, but these women, they weave unseen. You know, people don't see them. I think, you know, people are aware of the situation in Afghanistan and all the restrictions on women. They're not allowed to have a voice. They're not allowed to speak up. They're not allowed to work in the public sector. But they do work, and they work from home, and they create these beautiful, beautiful carpets that you'll see in warehouses or department stores in New York, in LA, and so on. And it gives them a voice, and it gives them agency. And I think having a sense of agency and a sense of control when so much is taken out of your control is very important and can contribute to healing. And to add to that as well, what we've seen in Myanmar with all these different ethnic groups, and you know, it's the longest ongoing civil war that's taking place in Myanmar since 1948. There's a lot of strife, of distrust, but they're also textiles, and celebrating and sharing those traditions can provide a platform for different groups to come together and to learn about each other through textiles as a kind of a gateway into the community, as a gateway into identity, into the past, into the history. And it can start a dialogue, and it can start to foster some sort of understanding and appreciation, which I think can contribute to healing at the societal level as well. Of course, it's not as easy as I make it out to be, but I do think that there's a role for textiles or for intangible heritage to play in that respect.
Yeah, and I fully understand what you're saying. I think we often see that in other projects that we do as well around the globe, where heritage or culture is under pressure, these projects give a sense of agency, as you say, in a very turbulent times, but also a perspective of hope on better times, and that they can actually, communities can work towards that in a constructive way, and they're being part of a solution. So we are very convinced that it's all very important, of course, but at the same time, I think artistic practices and textile arts is also very, very vulnerable type of heritage. You just mentioned the women working in Afghanistan, they're not seen, it's behind the scenes. There's, of course, traditional knowledge, it's modernization. You mentioned a lot of fast fashion production, etc. We don't know how to make these traditional fabrics anymore. How are you both working on protecting it, actually? And if you can reflect on that, you touched upon it a little bit already, Nathalie, but maybe in your practice, Enam, how are you working on protecting that heritage or that traditional practice?
Yeah, I actually worked with a master weaver in Ghana from the Eba tribe who was kind of telling me a little bit more about the history of weaving within the Eba tribe, and kind of was lamenting about the fact that he was worried about the longevity of the practice because young people didn't want to learn those crafts. They didn't see it as valuable anymore. They all wanted kind of big jobs in the city. And it's also, it's really hard for them to compete against kind of the big brands that are kind of creating these printed versions of our traditional cloths. And so for me, in working with him and using the cloth to then embed into my own artistic work, which is a new body of work I'm working on at the moment, it's kind of one of the small ways that I'm hoping to kind of preserve that history, but again, also use it as a platform to kind of highlight how important it is. Those crafts are so important to the heritage of, my Eba culture, and so also hoping to foster that kind of emotion in kind of the younger generation to see that value.
Yeah. And you described your work to me earlier also as a bit of a living archive.
Absolutely.
Is that also what you try to create?
Absolutely, yes, because I feel like, as I said before, so much of, our culture was embedding our stories into the textile. And so being able to kind of do that just even in my own kind of personal archive, telling my mother's stories through the work and things that, for us, it became a way to become even closer because we'd never had those conversations before about her own journey and story, and thinking that, that will live on, for her and tell those stories for the generations to come.
And how do you get younger generations then now to interact with your work? I'm just curious. How do they learn about it? Like, oh yeah, I see this. I understand what I have to do now.
So I do try as much as possible to run workshops. And I always try to create intergenerational spaces because I think that's also part of it, is learning from the older generation. And we don't get those opportunities that much to have those conversations. And it's a way for us to kind of also just talk about the Black women's experience and how making with your hands can be a way of kind of pushing through that journey, those emotions, and like you said, making something beautiful out of trauma can be a really positive way of channeling it. And as we say, and then that is your kind of your living archive, your visual archive of those experiences.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice to describe it in that way. And Nathalie, you already shared with us the projects in Myanmar, working in Afghanistan. You just mentioned to me that you're also now trying to see what you can do in Syria. But with that general experience that you see, of course, the artistic practices are very different. What are the most important things in keeping those practices alive, you think?
There are many different ways, many different things that you can do. I think the way that we approach it, and I'm looking at the sign from the Rosewood Amsterdam there, is again starting with the fundamentals of things. So there is a huge market out there that values and is willing to pay for handmade artisanal products, but they often don't know how to find the route to these artisan communities, and especially not in countries like Afghanistan, where I say Afghanistan, everyone thinks war and burqas. That is sadly the reality. Myanmar, people, I don't even know if they really have a clear picture. So the market's there, and we really function as a bridge to kind of connect those two worlds. So Myanmar weavers supplied actually the Rosewood Hotel in Yangon with beautiful fabrics that they otherwise would have sourced probably from Thailand or from China. So it's about bridging that market, and that really brings income back to communities, which is vital. And it's also a market that's willing to pay more often than local markets. Local markets are also often disrupted because of war, because of conflict in the places where we work. So the international market has a key role to play in preserving heritage. And then I think to what you were saying, it's about elevating craftsmanship. Perceptions persist that it's low-paid, manual work. People are not interested in it. And that's why it's kind of interesting because, of course, war and conflict are bad for these practices. But at the same time, what we call progress can also be bad for these practices because of urbanization. People don't want to do it anymore. So how can we elevate craftsmanship that it becomes attractive again for people? And very, you're doing that through your work. And what we're trying to do is to create exhibitions, to really provide a platform and a global stage for these practices, so that it's seen as something that people take pride in and that is appreciated, and that then hopefully can stimulate interest for practitioners to continue practicing their craft or to take it up.
Yeah. So actually, when you're both describing this, there is already quite a lot of overlap or similar approaches to keeping these artistic practices alive. Where else do you see synergies? So we have protecting a art practice from a heritage lens, but also in contemporary art practice. Where do you see synergies, or what are the ways in which the two, I think people often see them as separate, different worlds. How can they work more closely together, you think, to keep these practices alive?
I think even just having this space to kind of connect, because I feel like it's also not knowing what's available. And so being in the space, being able to connect and learn that there are already organizations doing this work. And so how can we, as kind of artists who are wanting to kind of, help protect and support, how can we kind of collaborate in some way? And so when we are at spaces such as this, there are, you know, if it's just me here, I can speak to that. You know, if Nathalie somewhere else, she can also speak to that. So I think coming together and collaborating is a really powerful way of, you know, we're stronger together, so we'll have more of an impactful voice, I think. So that will be an interesting way, I think, to kind of progress.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Do you have any views on this?
Well, I also think it's a continuum. We tend to divide objects into, well, there's craft and then there's high art.
Yeah.
And I think actually it's much more of a continuum. You've got weavers, then you've got master weavers, you've got artists. And when do you transition from one to the other? So I think the synergy is already there, and it's about, I think, approaching things creatively and not sticking to the boxes of, well, this is craft, that's art, and you know, preservation is not about keeping things exactly static and never changing again. Things always change. That's life. That's history. It's how can we infuse innovation with preservation? Because if you truly want to preserve something, it will have to move along with the times. Some of the carpets that the women in Afghanistan are weaving, they don't look exactly the same as they did 100 years ago. People like different colors now, and that's okay. So, and then of course, an artist as kind of, you know, you have a voice. You can shine a light on things and in ways that others can, and I think that's you also provide an in-way into these practices, and especially these practices, as we've been talking about, that are hidden for many people.
Yeah, exactly.
And you bring them out into the spotlight, which I think is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also are right in saying that, especially I feel art and textile practices have often been seen as a craft, like not necessarily seen as a recognized art practice, where actually recently we've seen more and more large exhibitions on textile arts in the Barbican, at MoMA, the Stedelijk Museum here in Amsterdam. So that platform actually that you're both describing to speak about the importance of this seems to be growing. Why do you think, Enam, that there's a renewed interest in textile arts as a medium and as an art form?
I think it kind of became inevitable because there are, collectors who have an interest in that. And so it became this kind of thing synonymously that collectors are wanting more of it. And so obviously as the demand grows, then, you see it more, on the kind of global arts platform. But I think also thinking about that time in COVID, it was very much a time when people are home and they already have paintings, they already have sculpture, and so they started to look at other art forms that could, broaden or expand their collections. And I also just think it was due time. It was very much due time. A lot of us as textile artists were also very vocal in the fact that these works were missing from collections, they were missing in the fairs, and so I think it was a combination of all those things at the right time. Which is really exciting to see.
And is that informing the way you are now creating your work in a way? Are you trying to tell an alternative story, or are you going with that flow? How are you responding to it?
Yeah, no, I think I'm very much going with the flow. I've always been a textile artist, and for me that was why I always called myself a textile artist, as a way of promoting it as an art form, and I will continue to do so. I just think I'm just very excited that there is so much more space, because there are so many incredible textile artists, and they're now getting space to kind of showcase what they do. And so I'm really interested to see where it will go.
Yeah, me too. And I also hear you're saying, okay, there's more of you. Are you working in a network of artists, or are you collectively saying, okay, we need to be louder about the importance of
Not
textile art?
necessarily. I think we all kind of connect because we respond to textiles. I'm very much, a haptic person. And so I always connect to textiles more so than other art forms. And so I think it's more a case of, I guess we have an informal kind of network in that we have conversations and kind of share experiences. And it's very much this thing of, some of us have been in the industry longer than others, so it's kind of sharing advice and just having that network of, it just keep going,
Yeah. Great. Before we go to the end of the conversation, I want to have one final question for the both of you, and that's actually related more to the why of this work, maybe also a bit in a broader sense, because we at Cultural Emergency Response always ask ourselves this question: why do we do this work? Why is it important? What difference is it making actually? And it's always a bit difficult to share that with other people because it's always in a story, right? And it's how you tell that story of other people. It's like, yes, it is actually very important to do, especially in crisis situations. So I'm curious how you see the impact of the work that you are doing, and maybe to start with you, Nathalie. In general, what is the impact or the difference that you see that the work you do with Turquoise Mountain makes for communities, especially in these challenging circumstances?
It's a bit self-congratulatory, but I think cultural heritage work really has the potential to be transformative. And one note that I want to make with that is that, because I work on the nexus of development and cultural heritage, and I've seen a lot of development projects, but what makes a cultural heritage approach quite unique is that it works with what is there, and it starts with appreciation. So most development projects start with identifying what is lacking, what is not there, or with a criticism. You're not treating your women right, you're not educating your children. This is actually, it starts with appreciation. And that's why I think the impact when it comes to livelihoods, well-being, fostering a sense of community, cohesion, all of that stuff that we touched upon is that much more sustainable and long-lasting, because these are projects that work with the grain, they work with the culture of a community rather than against it. And I've seen that very clearly in the places where we work. And to answer your question about the impact that it has, I think of a lady who I got to know in Myanmar, Masay Mpyo. She lived in Rakhine State, which is on the west of Myanmar. People may have heard about it in the context of the Rohingya crisis. She fled the conflict, settled outside of Yangon in an informal settlement with, I would say, her entire community. Informal settlements, not administered by the UN, the government, nothing. Left behind all her weaving tools. And, well, that was kind of it. There was no work, there was nothing to do, completely reliant on donations of other people. And then starting to work with that community, bringing loom tools, connecting them with suppliers of raw materials, working them on designs, on dyeing techniques that are more environmentally friendly, and then connecting them to those international markets has transformed her. She's now a master weaver. She leads a group of 20 other women in that community. She has a new skill set, managing people, working to deadlines, but it's also transformed the entire community because there's a purpose, there's income, and all with what is there, because really what was there was the knowledge and the skill that they have in their hands. So in a way, I think it's a very resource-light way of trying to create social impact.
Yeah, exactly. And also with a minimal way, almost offering a sense of continuity of cultural practice, but also of livelihood. Absolutely. And a sense of self and identity, because these people identified as weavers, and it's an important part of how they see themselves and their communities.
Yeah, and the connection with the history of the place that they left. Their kids they've not been back, but through weaving, they can tell the stories of the land, of the, you know, the flowers that they weave into the textiles. And that's very important to people who are on the run and who've left everything behind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's his own language, almost.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you, Enam, if you dream about the impact of your work, what do you hope that it is?
I think one piece is very much about kind of normalizing talking about mental health and trauma, specifically within the Black community, and thinking about ways that we can kind of close the loop. I talk about generational trauma a lot within my work. And so kind of normalizing that and then creating space to kind of work through it and kind of promoting, you know, arts and making by hand as a way of kind of dealing with those emotions. And then the other piece is also, like we've talked about, this platform for talking about sustainability, for talking about the impact of the fashion industry, and kind of really building that sense of value, and that, you know, people kind of think twice about buying fast fashion and thinking about alternative ways like mending and how you can very much then become part of this clothing that you wear kind of on a daily basis. So I think those two ways are kind of the kind of first touch of how I'm hoping that I'm instilling awareness. Yes.
And is there anything we can do to help you do that?
Yes, I think it's very much about, thinking about your impact in that way in terms of what you buy clothing-wise, but also, you know, supporting the textile arts practice, supporting organisations such as yours. It's really important to the sustainability of, you know, these cultures that are so important, you know.
Thank you for that. And thank you both for sharing your stories with us. And I think if there's something about this conversation that becomes clear is that it is way more than what we can see that there is to understand about art practice, and especially also textile arts and artistic practices. And but also the importance to protect it. And I think that we can all agree that especially in the world of today, we can actually use a little bit more voices and a platform to make people understand the important role of culture for communities and for, I would say, also more just and peaceful societies. And that's definitely something that we will continue to keep working on with cultural emergency response, but also with partners like you. So if we can help with platforms to making that heard, then always. But fact remains that we also cannot do that without support. So I would definitely want to invite you to follow our work, support our work, donate if you can, and also to spread the word about the importance of heritage protection, especially in times of crisis. Thank you all. Also, thank you, TEFAF, of course, for your long-standing partnership, and again offering us this platform with big conversations like this is where it starts. And thank you all for being here. We now have a luscious 15 minutes for questions and answers. So please let us know if you have any questions for the speakers. I see one here. Yes, that lady over there.
Can you help me? Hello, Kate Seymour from the ICOMCC, the International Council of Museum Conservation Committee. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm so interested in both the projects. Thank you for sharing with us. You talked a lot about the weaving, but and I was very interested about the root creating the yarn. But what about dyeing practices? About the colorants that are used? Could you both share a little bit of insight into what in Ghana is used and perhaps what in one of the projects that you've been worked in, Nathalie?
Part of what we try and do is actually revive natural dyeing techniques. So what you see is that when synthetic dyes were invented, they flooded the market and they were color fast and it's easy to use them. But actually these natural dyeing techniques are very part of communities, and they're really very much tied up with the land because people would use things that they find to create colors. So walnut for browns, indigo for blue, of course. Royan in Afghanistan, which is kind of a root for red. We're working with communities to document these, but then also to make sure that they're, again, fit for the international market, because it's very hard to replicate the exact same natural dye time and again. And we're also looking at the environmental impact. So natural dyes are 100 times better for the environment than synthetic dyes are, but it doesn't mean that they have no impact whatsoever. So seeing how with some kind of changes to the dyeing process, we can make it as environmentally friendly as possible is a big part of the work.
Yeah, I would say it's, similarly. So indigo dyeing is kind of a very big practice across West Africa. And even within my own work, I use natural dyes as much as possible. So a lot of my work, I tea stain or stain with coffee. So yeah, it's very much about thinking about how through all processes of making, the cloth, you are protecting our land and our environment as well.
Thanks. There in the back, yeah.
Thanks for the great sharing. This is Angel. I'm art lawyer from Shanghai, China. Would love to hear your sharing about how to keep the heritage sustainable through commercial collaboration and other opportunities. For example, licensing and also co-branding, etc. Because I'm personally deeply involved in that and very much to learn about the best practice here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nathalie, maybe.
Yeah, it's very much something that we're looking into, and in a way that is an issue because, and you'll have seen this, right? Some kind of ethnic design becomes trendy, and then all of a sudden everyone's wearing it. So we've started to look at the intellectual property of these designs and of these communities. It's not a single designer who creates something. It's kind of a collectively owned by the community. So we are starting to engage with that and see how we can protect that as best as we can. And then your question on commercial collaborations. Well, yeah, I think that is key. So yeah, or even commercial, but any collaboration. So whether it's artists working with local communities, or whether it's designers working with local communities, all of these collaborations can really help bridge the gap, because there is a gap, and be very fruitful in many different ways. Everyone learns from each other, and yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I know there are quite a few brands. So there's one called Axe, which is a Ghanaian-owned brand, and they support a community of women weavers in the north of Ghana, and they supply anthropology and a whole kind of host of stores, and they've started to expand and make not only bags but home accessories. And then you have a space like Nubuke Foundation, which is an art space in Accra in Ghana, but they support, again, a local kind of weaving community, again, in the north of Ghana, and they kind of make artistic works that they profile at fairs. And so there are kind of these really beautiful kind of collaborations, especially that they're Ghanaian owned and supporting the communities, that I hope to see more of and engage with myself.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes, one here.
Hello, once again, thank you for a beautiful presentation. I'm actually wondering how, because you mentioned many times that these communities are very difficult to find, how do you navigate these communities, how you discover them, and do you choose specific ones to work with? If so, like, what are you looking for? Like, what it should be to be interesting for you to develop, to preserve? Are there any criteria or something like this? Thank you.
I think key is to be on the ground. So it's not about flying in and out. We've been in Afghanistan since 2006. Everyone who works with the communities lives there. And we have, largely local teams. And then how do we find these communities? What we usually do is a mapping when we start somewhere. So we map the craft environment, we map where the artisan communities are, we map the types of crafts that they do, how much threat are they experiencing. When a craft is flourishing, we're not needed. So it's when we see that there's pressure either on the craft, it's disappearing, or it's losing its authentic techniques, that we would say, okay, we step in. And then we're also just looking for very exceptional craftsmanship. So if I take goldsmithing, the best goldsmiths in Myanmar come from a little island off the coast in the Bay of Bengal. So those are the goldsmiths that we would want to work with, but also that need our help. So it's a combination of the two. But it's born out of this craft mapping and seeing where is the need and where is the opportunity.
Any other questions still? No? Another one. Yes, please. We have some time, so please.
Thank you so much. But then it's a question to the artist, because I'm also very curious as an artist and a textile designer, what kind of support do you expect by organizations? What you actually need for your practice to be supported and to be ongoing?
I think it's, platforms such as this, it's, continuing to have invested interest in textile arts. I think it's also a thing that is laborious. It's something that it takes time to make a piece as opposed to a painting. And so it's understanding that I think, as textile artists, we need time to really invest in, the expertise of our craft and making the work. And I do actually want to just highlight my gallery, Taffeta, because they have been so supportive from the beginning of us kind of working together and really understanding the ethos behind my work. And I think that's kind of super important as well, is, those relationships that you have in the art world and how they, do the work to understand your practice and profile it in the right way. So
yeah, great. And you have some works on display
yes,
also now.
yes.
So if you're curious to see this in real life, you can. Great. Thank you. Yes, one more question.
My name is Sadie Sherman, and I represent Enam at TEFAF. I would love for you to explain your two beautiful bodies of work that we are exhibiting here today. This is Enam's debut to TEFAF. We're so happy to have her here, and I'd love to hear you describe it because it's two really beautiful bodies of work.
Yeah, thank you. So these are new pieces of work that are very much inspired by a work that I just made. So I'll explain. I'm now doing my MFA in art practice at Stanford, and so I have just made this massive 10 by 19 foot quilt out of natural silk or chiffon and nylon tights. And I use the image of my mother, and it's a very specific image of her when she had just finished her nurse's training. She'd moved from Ghana to the UK, and she was part of this massive influx of African and Caribbean people to the UK, kind of at the tail end of the Windrush era. And many of them worked in the NHS, our National Health Service. And I had never spoken to my mother about her experiences. And this was the first time that she shared, some of the kind of racism that she experienced from patients and from colleagues. And it very much started me thinking about how Black women have always kind of been in these spaces of care, but not necessarily received that themselves. And also thinking about how that trauma gets embedded and then passed on from generation to generation. And so thinking about that story, I use the work as a way to document that, but also to celebrate her for all her sacrifice, give her the kind of thanks that maybe she hasn't gotten, and many, of the African Caribbean community haven't gotten. And so these works are paper interpretations of that piece, and they also include embroidery in gold, and so I often use natural metals within the works as a way of kind of inciting healing, thinking about the healing properties that these metals have, but also the long-standing history of gold in Ghana and the British Empire. And so it also is a space to kind of document our our kind of native tongue as well, because it's something that I'm wanting to learn. I can understand it, but I don't speak it as much. And it's again that thing of, the legacy of our culture and our history, and the language is so much important part of that. And so wanting to also kind of memorialize that and include that in the archive. So yes, so please do go and see that.
Exactly.
Could you maybe mention the stand number for everyone?
608.
608.
So do go back into the fair and have a look at Enam's wonderful work.
I think we are going to wrap it up, right, Simone? Or do we still have time? No? Any more questions? Last one. I can fit one. No? Yes.
Yes, again, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I have a question for Enam specifically in this case. So as a Ghanese woman or a woman with Ghanese heritage, not being born in that country, the connection that you found with your country and your heritage, can you explain a little bit more about that journey from a personal perspective and whether it came from external factors such as family or other relatives, or from some internal drive that you have as a person?
Yeah, great question. So I grew up in the UK, and those of us from the diaspora always talk about this idea of outside you're in England, and then when you come home you're in Ghana, and so that was very much my experience. But then we also moved to Ghana when I was 7, and I lived there for 5 years, and so that was my first real understanding of what it is to be Ghanaian, what it is to be Ewe. And actually that is where my love for textiles grew, because as a young child, one of my very first kind of lasting memories is my mother taking me to this weaving village, and I was just mesmerized by these beautiful yarns that had been dyed and they were out in the sun drying, and this weaver kind of on a loom. And it wasn't until I became a textile artist that I remembered that and realized how that was a lasting memory, but also the fact that it was so inherent to who I am, because Ewe people are weavers and performers. And I think as I've kind of grown in my practice and my artistic voice, it's just naturally been this thing that I want to kind of learn more and connect more to that. And so, yeah, it's an ongoing journey. But I think one of the beautiful things that the master weaver told me is that there's this myth that spiders taught us to weave. And when I did my degree show, my final year body of work was all about spider webs. I've always been obsessed with spider webs. So for me, it was like this full circle moment of, okay, this is always who I was meant to be. And so I'm kind of leaning into that more.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you both very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did too, and thank you for all the nice questions. And we'll be around here a little bit more if you would like to talk. Thank you.